Max Blumenthal, shall we, ladies and gentlemen?
Yes.
He's the editor for the investigative journalism website, The Gray Zone. He's the author of many books. The most recent is The Management of Savagery. Welcome, Max Blumenthal.
How you doing, Jimmy?
I'm doing fantastic, pal. So, Bill Gates. So now, people still operate under the belief that Bill Gates is this great guy and that he just cares about people and because he's a nerd, right? Now, we've showed you at the show how people use their identity to hide their nefariousness, like how Chris Hayes uses that he's a nerd, and you would never think he would do the bidding of the military-industrial complex. You would never think that, or the intelligence community, but he does. Same thing with Rachel Maddow. You would never. So there's a nerd and a gay person, and at the joke that Paul.
You're telling me Maddow and Chris Hayes are two different people? Because I wasn't aware of that.
I'm not kidding.
I thought it was one person who impersonated the other.
I like to think that Chris Hayes isn't as horrible as Rachel Maddow, but they both are.
He had the potential to. Well, both of them had the potential to not be horrible. And cognitive capture, we talk about it all the time.
Yes, and Chris Hayes even wrote about it in his book, and he just let it happen to him. Anyway, so there's this great article in the Min Press News, right? And let me see who wrote it. It's read by Alan McLeod. I think that's how you pronounce his name.
Yeah. And
so we found out. So I've covered this before that Bill Gates has this. He does a lot of nefarious stuff. Like, for instance, he'll fund the medical reporting at PBS Nightly News, right? The News Hour. So he'll give them a big grant, and it has to be used to cover this medical stuff. And what medical stuff do they cover? Vaccine research, and then vaccine rollout, and who is also funding that? Bill Gates has got his fingers in the vaccine thing. So he gives a news show money to go under the guise of covering medicine or health, but they're directed to go cover the stuff that he's invested in. So that doesn't seem right. I reported that before. So not only is he invested in let's say you made a product, whatever it was, let's say you made a widget, and then you gave a grant to PBS to cover that widget's development, and then they also covered it when it got rolled out, but they never told you why they're covering it or who's funding the coverage. That would be what they're doing, right? So that's the stuff that he just does that with medical stuff. So we covered that before. Now the Min Press News has blown the roof off this. They found out all this stuff that he's been buying media coverage, favorable media coverage through hundreds of millions of dollars. And so let's go through it, and Max, you can just comment on whatever you feel like it. So after sorting through over 30,000 individual grants, Mint Press can reveal that Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, BMGF, has made over $300 million worth of donations to fund media projects. $300 million to fund media. That's a lot of money. Recipients of this cash include many of America's most important news outlets, including CNN, NBC, NPR, PBS, and The Atlantic. Gates also sponsors a myriad of influential foreign organizations, including the BBC, The Guardian, the Financial Times, and the Daily Telegraph in the United Kingdom. Prominent European newspapers such as Le Monde, Der Spiegel, and El País. How do you say that?
El País.
El País. I was close. I should have just went with it.
A Spanish center-left paper that pushed Russiagate really heavily until it replaced its editor.
Oh, really? He also funds big global broadcasters like Al Jazeera. The Gates Foundation's money goes towards media programs, has been split up into a number of sections presented in descending numerical order. So this is from the article. There's just NPR, $24 million. The Guardian, $12 million. Cascade Public Media, $10 million. Public Radio International, $7 million. So Der Spiegel, so there it is. Look at KCET down at the bottom, $3 million. Look at that. That's right here in Los Angeles, KCET. Here's another one.
Oh my God.
It works directly to media outlets. So the Daily Telegraph, right? So Financial Times, the Texas Tribune, Al Jazeera, ProPublica, Crosscut Public Media. Now this... we could keep going. There's some more from PBS. We could keep going, but you get the idea, right? So he's giving millions and millions of dollars to get positive press coverage for whatever the F he wants. And guess what? He gets it. Together, these donations total $166,216,526. The money is generally directed towards issues close to the Gates' hearts. Gates's, for example, is that really how you say that? Gates's? For example, the $3.6 million CNN grant went towards reporting on gender equality with a particular focus on least developed countries, producing journalism on the everyday inequalities endured by women and girls across the world. While the Texas Tribune received millions to increase public awareness and engagement of education reform issues in Texas. Given that Bill is one of the charter school's most fervent supporters, a cynic, that would be me, might interpret this as planting pro-corporate charter school propaganda into the media disguised as objective news reporting. So that's what's happening all over the place. He's buying news space, which should be advertisements, and they're just printing it as objective news. Would you agree with that, Max? Would you agree with that? That's what's kind of happening?
Definitely. I mean, many of the grants come with strings attached. They're earmarked generally to produce positive coverage of initiatives where Gates and his global empire have investments, especially on global public health, but also on things like education reform, which really represents education privatization and pushing Microsoft and various other big tech solutions in the classroom. So it's very clear what's going on here. But the backstory, I think, of why Gates started doing this is fascinating. Bill Gates was essentially born with a silver foot in his mouth. His great-grandfather, as the late Ann Richards said of George Bush. I think it was George W. Bush he said that about. His great-grandfather, Frederick Taylor Gates, was a wealthy banker, one of the wealthiest men in the Seattle area. And so he inherited millions. And his mother was sitting on the board of the United Way with the then chairman of IBM in 1980. And her son, Bill, had just started this little startup, this firm that was, pioneering software at a time and computers or computing at a time when most Americans were using typewriters still. I think he founded it, Microsoft co-founded it in 1976. So she works out a sweetheart deal for IBM to give the rights for its operating system to her son, Bill Gates, through her pal, the head of IBM. And that launches Gates as this computing impresario, a wealthy man who's seen as a genius in the media. He then connives to force out his co-founders, so he gets the sole rights to Microsoft. I mean, he stabs his pals in the back, including a friend who had just gone through chemo and radiation when he was at his weakest point. And then he proceeds to, he attempts to establish a monopoly through Microsoft. And by 1998, Bill Gates is facing massive antitrust lawsuits. There's a chance that Microsoft is going to be broken up. He's pied in the face in public. The public is beginning to organize against him, including online. And so he does what his great-grandfather, Frederick Taylor Gates, told John D. Rockefeller, the monopolizing founder of Standard Oil and son of a literal snake oil salesman, to do, which is to put all of his money into charity and PR. Frederick Taylor Gates was the consigliere to John D. Rockefeller, founder of the Rockefeller Foundation, which is bound up with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in advancing all of these public health initiatives that they happen to be invested in, which are highly profitable and not always very efficacious, shall we say. So first of all, Bill Gates starts trying to push magic bullet solutions to public health crises, like particularly in Africa, like HIV. He and Anthony Fauci team up to push the HIV vaccine, or the AIDS vaccine, which has never come to fruition. The latest trial to fail was an mRNA HIV vaccine backed by Gates through Johnson & Johnson, completely flopped in Africa. I mean, it was like 30% efficacy rate. And he's also starting to get bad press. In 2007, the LA Times, in a piece called Unintended Victims of Gates Foundation Generosity by Charles Pillar and Doug Smith. This is a really important article. And actually, RFK Jr. flags it in his new book on Fauci because it's one of the few articles in mainstream media that's actually critical of Gates. In this article, the authors, it's actually a series of articles, show in Lesotho, in southern Africa, how what Gates is actually doing is producing a net negative result for Africans because he's pushing magic bullet solutions like vaccines and things that he can profit from because he controls the intellectual property rights at the expense of cheaper solutions, like, for example, mosquito nets, which can help prevent malaria, oxygen tubes. There was a shortage in Lesotho of oxygen tubes while Gates was pushing expensive anti-AIDS drugs, and people were dying of asphyxiation. These are tubes that cost $35. And it's the whole concept of public health that Gates embraces, which is not to treat the environment and introduce sanitary solutions or better engineering or to treat the entire person to build up their immune system to advance early treatments. It's instead magic bullets like vaccines, and it's all playing out in front of our eyes in the pandemic, which refuses to end. So Gates actually starts getting bad PR for his monopolizing practices, for his failures in Africa, which are colonial in nature. And then he figures out that the media is for sale. And it was around this time, really in the early 2000s, but around the mid-2000s, when he starts earmarking all of these grants to PBS, The Guardian, and all of these other mainstream outlets, at a time, by the way, when the media was shrinking because of online media and was basically on life support, to advance, to do basically PR propaganda for his very dubious public health initiatives and his education reform initiatives, which were under attack from teachers' unions and people who actually didn't want education to be privatized. The pandemic has been like the perfect storm for Bill Gates. It's not as if he hasn't been preparing for it. His fortune has increased by $23 billion just through the lockdowns of 2020 because so many people were forced to rely on the tech platforms that Microsoft produces. And we've seen just this week, Detroit public schools, almost entirely black and brown public school district, one of the poorest public school districts in the country, announced that they're going to send kids home from school one day a week, supposedly to prevent COVID, because COVID only comes out on Friday, apparently. While the white kids in the affluent suburbs of Detroit, the white flight suburbs, they're getting 5 days of school, and that means their parents get to get 5 days of work, especially their mothers. Why is this happening? Is this really about COVID? No, it's about rolling back public education, ending in the gradual plan to end in-person learning, and forcing kids, especially the poorest kids, onto big tech platforms, big tech applications that are profitable for people like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or whoever. And so they're testing on these kids the same way that we've seen the failed AIDS vaccines be tested on black residents of Baltimore and Washington or the people of Africa. All of this is taking place as Bill Gates has just dumped money on the media and controlled the World Health Organization through his crony, Tedros Adhanom, who was actually a board member of 2 Gates-controlled foundations before he was appointed to the WHO. Gates is controlling this entire apparatus, and we don't hear anything critical about him except by Alan McLeod, outstanding media critic in Mint Press, who's reported that Gates has donated $318 million to the media. I think Columbia Journalism Review reported last year was $250 million, so it keeps going up. And from the likes of Jagoff nightclub comedian. But the rest of the media is just, it's a cover-up.
Well, it really works too, Max. I'll tell you, because I was out to dinner again with my old roommate, and he's just a fastball down the middle, regular consumer of news, of the most normal guy in the world. And when I started talking to him about how Bill Gates is a nefarious character, he just almost fell off his chair. He's like, I can't believe you guys say that shit about that guy. What are you talking about? And so people, again, it's just a propaganda. It's just like, well, of course, Russia Gate's real. It's everywhere. It's on every. So it's just that thing. And so look at all that media he's purchased. So there's a little bit more to this article I want to actually go through. The Gates. So and so you agree, Max? What he's doing with health is he doesn't want to really rely on governments per se. He wants to find a way to privatize health and put a profit motive in it. Right? Would you say?
He's already found the way. I mean, he's doing it, and it's at the heart of his foundation. The more money he gives away, the more money he makes, because he's contributing to initiatives advanced by, for example, big pharma companies that he's invested in, like AstraZeneca.
Right. So the Gates Foundation has also given nearly $63 million to charities, closely aligned with big media outlets, including nearly $53 million to BBC Media Action, over $9 million to MTV's Staying Alive Foundation, and $1 million to the New York Times Neediest Causes Fund. Gates continues to underwrite a wide network of investigative journalism centers as well, totaling just over $38 million, more than half of which has gone to the DC-based International Center for Journalists to expand and develop African media. Boy, this guy is good. This guy is good. So here's all the media places, right? International Center for Journalists, $20 million. Premium Time Center for Investigative Journalism, $3 million. The Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, $2 million. So you see what he's doing. Okay. In addition to this, the Gates Foundation also piles press and journalism associations with cash to the tune of at least $12 million. For example, the National Newspaper Publishers Association, a group representing more than 200 outlets, he gave them $3.2 million. This is amazing. So there's a list of organizations that's Educators Writers Association, National Newspapers Publishers Association, National Press Foundation, Washington News Council. So you see, this guy's got an angle on every. The foundation also puts up the money to directly train journalists all over the world in the form of scholarships, courses, and workshops. Today, it is possible for an individual to train as a reporter thanks to the Gates Foundation brand, find work at a Gates-funded outlet, and then belong to a press association also funded by Gates. This is what I'm talking about. I think this guy's got a little too much control over the way news and information gets passed around. This is especially true of journalists working in the fields of health, education, and global development, the ones Gates himself is most active in, and where scrutiny of the billionaire's actions and motives are most necessary. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation also pays for a wide range of specific media campaigns campaigns around the world. For example, since 2014, it has donated $5.7 million to the Population Foundation of India in order to create dramas that promote sexual and reproductive health with the intent to increase family planning methods in South Asia. Meanwhile, it allotted over $3.5 million to a Senegalese organization to develop radio shows and online content that would feature health information. Supporters consider this to be helping critically underfunded media, while opponents might consider it a case of a billionaire using his money to plant his ideas and opinions into the press under the guise of objective news. That's the problem. Here's some media projects that he's funded. Look at Harvard University. Got $1 million from it. The Learning Matters, Open Cities Lab, Center for Advocacy and Research, New America, World University Service. God damn, this guy. There's more. Look at all of these more media projects. I can't even. Added together, these Gates-sponsored media projects come to a total of $319.4 million. However, there are clear shortcomings with this non-exhaustive list, meaning the true figure is undoubtedly far higher. First, it does not count subgrants, money given by recipients to media around the world. And while the Gates Foundation fosters an air of openness about itself, there is actually precious little public information about what happens to the money from each grant, save for a short 1 or 2 sentence description written by the foundation itself on its website. Only donations to press organizations themselves or projects that could be identified from the information on the Gates Foundation website as media campaigns were counted, meaning that thousands of grants having some media element do not appear on that list. So they're making the point that he's giving even more money, he's got even more control, he's got even his fingers in more agencies and institutions than they're even reporting. That's what he's saying. So a case in point is Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's partnership with Viacom CBS, the company that controlled CBS News, MTV, VH1, Nickelodeon, and BET. Media reports at the time noted that the Gates Foundation was paying the entertainment giant to insert information and PSAs into the programming, and that Gates had intervened to change storylines in popular shows like ER, Law and Order, SVU. Get the F frickin' out of here. So, however, when checking Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's grants database, Viacom and CBS are nowhere to be found. The likely grant in question, totaling over $6 million, merely describing the project as a public engagement campaign aimed at improving high school graduation rates and post-secondary completion rates, specifically aimed at parents and students, meaning that it was not counted in the official total. There are surely many more examples like that. So there's one $6 million example that they don't even count in the total. For a tax-privileged charity that so often trumpets the importance of transparency, it's remarkable how intensely secretive the Gates Foundation is about its financial flows. Tim Schwab, one of the few investigative journalists who has scrutinized the tech billionaire, told Mint Press. Also not included are grants aimed at producing articles for academic journals. While these articles are not meant for mass consumption, they regularly form the basis for stories in the mainstream press and help shape narratives around key issues. The Gates Foundation has given far and wide to academic sources, with at least $13.6 million going towards creating content for the prestigious medical journal, The Lancet. Get the fuck out of here! This is unbelievable. That the Gates Foundation is underwriting a significant chunk of our media ecosystem leads to serious problems with objectivity. You think the foundation's grants to media organizations raise obvious conflict of interest questions? How can reporting be unbiased when a major player holds the purse strings, wrote Gates' local Seattle Times in 2011? This was before the newspaper accepted Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation money to fund its education lab section. The whole section, so they put a freaking section in their newspaper that's totally funded by Bill Gates, the education lab section. Isn't that awesome? Schwab's research has found that this conflict of interest goes right to the very top. 2 New York Times columnists have been writing glowingly about the Gates Foundation for years without disclosing that they also work for a group, the Solutions Journalism Network, that, as shown above, has received over $7 million from the tech billionaire's charity. So that is, if I fucking was doing that, I'd be laughed out of YouTube. But the New York Times does that, and nobody gives a fucking shit. If they found out I was doing that, holy shit. I was taking money from someone to give them glowing fucking... That is unbelievable. That is unbelievable. Go ahead.
The New York Times called Bill Gates the most interesting man in the world. That's a headline.
That's amazing. Earlier this year, Schwab also declined to co-report on a story about 𝐁𝐲𝐿 for the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, suspecting that the money Gates had been pumping into the outlet would make it impossible to accurately report on a subject so close to Gates' heart. Sure enough, when the article was published last month, it repeated the assertion that Gates had little to do with 𝐁𝐲𝐿's failures, mirroring the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation stance and quoting them throughout. Only at the very end of the more than 5,000-word story did it reveal that the organization it was defending was paying the wages of its staff. Come on. I don't believe Gates told the Bureau of Investigative Journalism what to write. I think the Bureau implicitly, if subconsciously, knew they had to find a way to tell the story that didn't target their funder. The biasing effects of financial conflicts are complex, but very real and reliable, Schwab said, describing it as a case study in the perils of Gates-funded journalism. Gates, who amassed his fortune by building a monopoly and zealously guarding his intellectual property, bears significant blame for the failure of the coronavirus vaccine rollout across the world. Quite aside from the 𝐁𝐲𝐿 fiasco, he pressured Oxford University not to make its publicly funded vaccine open source and available to everyone for free, but instead... Bill Gates told them to partner with private corporation AstraZeneca, a decision that meant that those who could not pay were blocked from using that vaccine, and it meant millions and millions in profits for Oxford. Gates has made over 100 donations to the university, totaling hundreds of millions of dollars, likely played some role in that decision. To this day, fewer than 5% of the people in low-income countries have received even one dose of COVID vaccine. The death toll from this is immense. Unfortunately, many of these real criticisms of Gates and his network are obscured by wild and untrue conspiracy theories about such things as inserting microchips in vaccines to control the population. I wouldn't be surprised if Bill Gates funded those conspiracy theories himself. I wouldn't be surprised if he did that, because then it distracts everybody from the real nefarious shit you're doing, and then everybody thinks whenever anybody says anything about you, that it's just some wild conspiracy theory. That's crazy.
Well, now it comes from, I hate to say it, but it comes from a technology that that so-called conspiracy theory does derive from actual technology that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are funding, which is a microneedle array patch for the rubella vaccination, which is administered under the skin. And, there's this quantum .I concept that stores a person's vaccination history under their skin, which, the Smithsonian has an article, this spiky patch could invisibly record vaccination history under skin. And obviously, this is from 2019, before the pandemic led to all of this censorship. But at the early phases of the pandemic, when many people were wondering what kind of horrors would come out of it as elites like Bill Gates exploit these kind of crises to advance their exotic technologies. This was something people focused on. And what you see is a conflation with the ethical concerns about marking people under their skin, a technology that, as far as I know, is not being advanced through any of the COVID vaccines. The conflation of that with microchip conspiracies in order to paint everyone who has these ethical concerns as crazy or idiotic. But we have to understand that Bill Gates is investing in some very exotic and ethically dubious technologies.
So that's where that comes from. Wow, Max, you are up on this Bill Gates guy like nobody. I really did a good job getting you on the show today. So
I know other stuff too.
Okay, we're gonna get.
I know shit.
This has meant that genuine critiques of the Microsoft co-founder are often demonetized and algorithmically suppressed, meaning that outlets are strongly dissuaded from covering the topic, knowing they will likely lose money if they do. The paucity of scrutiny of the world's second richest individual in turn feeds into outlandish suspicions. Gates certainly deserves it. Quite apart from his deep and potentially decades-long ties to the infamous Jeffrey Epstein, his attempts to radically change African society and his investment in controversial chemical giant Monsanto, he is perhaps the key driver behind the American charter school movement, an attempt to essentially privatize the U.S. educational system. Charter schools are deeply unpopular with teachers' unions, which see the movement as an attempt to lessen their autonomy and reduce public oversight into how and what children are taught. None of this means that the organizations receiving Gates' money, media or otherwise, are irredeemably corrupt, nor that the Gates Foundation does not do any good in the world, but it does introduce a glaring conflict of interest, whereby the very institutions we rely on to hold accountable one of the richest and most powerful men in the planet's history are quietly being funded by him. This conflict of interest is one that corporate media have largely tried to ignore, while the supposedly altruistic philanthropist Gates just keeps getting richer, laughing all the way to the bank. And so this is, I just want to throw this in there. Bill Gates is now the largest farmland owner in America too. So I don't know what the fuck he's up to, but it ain't good. I'll tell you that. So what else? So if that doesn't send chills down your spine, that the second richest guy in the world is basically co-opting all the global media to give him positive coverage while he tries to fuck with the whole planet and shape it in his vision, while becoming even richer doing it. You know, ever since he announced he's going to give away all his money, I think he doubled his money since then. What? How do you double? I don't know if that's the exact number, but his wealth went skyrocketed after he announced he's going to give away all his money. Well, when are you going to fucking do that? Anyway, so Max, what would you like to say at the conclusion of that great article in Mint Press?
Yeah, it's a great piece. I think we should republish it at the Gray Zone to give it more visibility.
Yeah.
Alan McLeod does great work all the time, and so does Mint Press. We, I think, published the seminal expose on Bill Gates during the pandemic last year by Michelle Greenstein and Jeremy Lafredo. And I just want to point everyone to that piece. It's called "Why the Bill Gates Global Health Empire Promises More Empire and Less Public Health." And what it covers every aspect of the corruption and just the sinister nature of Bill Gates' global health empire, including his testing of toxic products on the African population, often doing grievous harm to the most vulnerable people on Earth. So at the beginning of the pandemic, Netflix published this docuseries. I don't know if you remember this. It released it, Pandemic, How to Prevent an Outbreak. It was just like ready for the pandemic. I mean, basically like when the World Health Organization, which Bill Gates controls, declared a pandemic, I think it was like March 18th or March 20th, 2020, the blue balls of Bill Gates' global empire just exploded onto the planet, and he was finally able to release this titanic agenda. And this Netflix series was part of the propaganda campaign that had been prepared ahead of time for any massive public health crisis to present Bill Gates, someone who dropped out of Harvard and has no medical training, no medical degree, no medical experience, no degree in public health, as the world's leading public health expert. And who produced this documentary? It was someone named Sherry Fink, who was a New York Times correspondent. She was like at the time their lead correspondent on the pandemic and on COVID. And her career trajectory had taken her through 3 Bill Gates funded organizations: ProPublica, the New America Foundation, and the International Medical Corps. So Gates funding all of this media has a ricochet effect where everyone who comes out of these organizations moves into other ones like the New York Times, and making his control over media almost complete. I mean, I wouldn't say Bill Gates controls the entire media, but his influence is almost totalistic. And so you have someone like Sherry Fink, who's ostensibly a journalist, playing PR person for someone who has no actual expertise in public health and just simply has a lot of money. And then you would just see Gates rolled out on interview after interview throughout March and April 2020 as the leading public health expert, until Americans who are stuck at home under lockdown, this completely unscientific lockdown based on a phony model published by Neil Ferguson, a complete fraud modeler with no degree in epidemiology at the Imperial College in London, which is funded by Bill Gates, that provided the justification for the lockdown. Everyone's stuck at home. And so they're treated to a concert with all sorts of pop stars, Yo-Yo Ma, Dave Letterman hosting, and it's called Vax Live, the concert to reunite the world, by Global Citizen, another group run basically by Bill Gates. And it's to create momentum, psychological momentum for the COVID vaccine as the end to the lockdown and to all the restrictions. You're at home. You just have to sit there, adopt a calm mentality. Don't question anything. Just wait for the vaccine. And Bill and Melinda Gates appeared at the end of this concert to reassure everyone that everything will be fine once the vaccine arrives. No one's told that Bill Gates has invested in the development of these vaccines and will profit from it because he owns so many shares in a who's who of big pharma titans, as you pointed out, Jimmy, with the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, which he blocked from becoming public. So it's amazing if you look at the description of what Vax Live was. A concert to reunite the world is a global broadcast special celebrating COVID-19 vaccines. And we're calling on world leaders to make vaccines accessible to everyone everywhere. But as we know, Bill Gates, once the vaccines were developed, fought tooth and nail to prevent them from becoming available to everyone everywhere, because that would have meant overriding or providing a waiver on the TRIPS intellectual property that gives Bill Gates and Big Pharma control over the patents. It would have allowed them to be produced and distributed in the global south. And we saw, there's a really important piece actually by my friend Alexander 𝐁𝐧𝐽 in the New Republic that was published in April of this year called How Bill Gates Impeded Global Access to COVID Vaccines. And it shows how at a certain point, even Joe Biden was calling out Bill Gates for, he said you cannot obstruct, we need to waive the intellectual property rights here in order to get these out to Africa and elsewhere. And I think, Biden might have used some kind of like, well, the point is that it came down to a battle between supposedly the leader of the most powerful country in the world and Bill Gates. And Bill Gates won. He just simply said, no, I don't care. And we are going to rely on COVAX instead, where everything is distributed through big pharma with the intellectual property rights. And Bill Gates has just revealed that he actually doesn't care about public health. If to the extent that these COVID vaccines were a public health solution, and we can raise questions about that. I mean, the death toll in Africa is paradoxically low for the level of vaccination, but that's beside the point. This demonstrates once again that Bill Gates doesn't care about public health. He cares about his own private wealth, and that's why he fought every leader in the world and won to maintain those intellectual property rights. And we should remember that in the early 90s, Bill Gates was fighting none other than Nelson Mandela, who sought to resolve or remedy the massive AIDS crisis unfolding in his country and across the African continent by producing generic AZT drugs, antiretrovirals, which were suddenly available. And Gates supported the lawsuit against Mandela. I mean, this is a straight up monster, and it's all about his own money. So the media is perpetuating one of the most sinister lies in recent history by portraying Bill Gates as a public health expert, when all he is
a rich guy.
He's a devious snake oil salesman, just like his great-grandfather's pal, John D. Rockefeller. I mean, and a monopolizer. And that's what he is. And the media is being paid by him to promote him. So that really speaks to the value, I think, of the few alternative media outlets that are still willing to publish critical reporting on one of the two richest men in the world who's effectively controlling global health policy.
Returning to work!
With ClickUp, our calendars have never been more in sync. Now our project timelines, meeting.
It's just, this is a stunning story. I mean, I knew he was doing that. I had no idea to what extent. I had no idea to how many, his fingers were in so many institutions, so many things that you don't associate with. It's just charities and journalistic research in places and journalism schools. And this is
And the richer he gets, the more he invests in these charities and journalism schools, and the more the media falls under the control of him and our other feudal lords. The more land he owns, the more he devours policy and physical space. Who's going to stop him? And one of the frightening things about this period, Jimmy, is that it feels like the critique of Bill Gates as a global monster is mostly situated on the right of the political spectrum.
Yes.
Whereas they're sitting back and saying, like, yeah, he's great, he's giving us these vaccines, and we just, he's gonna end this.
I tweeted out at I don't know when, but I think at the beginning of this COVID thing, when I saw them interviewing Bill Gates about the vaccines and stuff like that and how we should handle COVID. And I'm just sitting there going, what in the fuck is someone interviewing Bill Gates, a guy who never even graduated college, about how to handle a global pandemic health crisis? The fuck does he know about it? I'll tell you what he knows about it. Nothing. He didn't even graduate college. He's just a guy with a lot of money. He's the second richest guy in the world, so he can control the media. This doesn't scare anybody, that a guy who has that kind of power. So now he's the #1 farmland owner in the United States. He's got his fingers in everything. This should scare the shit. So of course he's a monopolist. Of course that's the and it's just because he looks like a nerd. He looks like, look, he's got a sweater on. How can he possibly be nefarious? The guy is a monster and a monopolist, and he'll crush you.
Saying the whole pandemic is like Revenge of the Nerds, except the nerds are the bullies, and they're not fighting the system, and they'll never let this go. They'll never let this moment go until they can move on to another crisis. So we see Bill Gates warning about a smallpox attack.
Oh, yes.
and then strangely, some smallpox vials are found. I'm not saying this is connected to Bill Gates, but they're marked. I think they have Merck labels on them, and he owns a ton of shares in Merck. But I'm not saying it's a Bill Gates conspiracy. But when Bill Gates speaks and warns of a crisis, we have to actually pay attention and brace ourselves.
Man, just think about all that power that money brings him. And he figured it out. You're right. I remember he got pied in the face in the 90s. I've seen that video. I remember when public opinion was turning against him, and then he got smart and just decided to buy the media. That's exactly what Big Pharma does. That's exactly what Wall Street does. That's exactly what the military-industrial complex does. They buy the media, which is why I have a show that's popular and why the Gray Zone exists, right? Because we're not bought media. It's amazing. This is amazing.
Yeah. By the way, PolitiFact has published a piece. There's no evidence linking Bill Gates to the vials labeled smallpox found at Merck lab freezer. But who funds PolitiFact at the Poynter Institute? Bill Gates. So it's like, yeah, I'm sure Bill Gates wasn't like, I mean, I'm not sure, but I don't believe that Bill Gates, I don't have any evidence Bill Gates is behind these vials, but nobody's going to believe that if they know that Bill Gates funds the fact checker that exists solely to defend Bill Gates and every other establishment narrative. And like, even if they can't correct the fact, they'll introduce a fact check, which you'll find on the right side of your Twitter timeline. Insufficient context for this quote that makes Fauci look bad. And I'm like, where's the context remains the same. So you remember, I think you played this FDA Commissioner Dr. Eric Rubin saying the only way to know if these vaccinating children for COVID is effective or safe is to start doing it. I'm not quoting it precisely. The video of that quote went around pretty widely. And then PolitiFact came out with a fact check. Insufficient context, because the video clipped out maybe 2 seconds where Rubin says, like we did with rubella, which doesn't change the context of the quote at all.
No, not at all. I played the whole thing on my show. I didn't clip anything out.
And PolitiFact's going after you too, I think.
Oh, twice at least over COVID and vaccines. And it's funny when they have somebody fact check our work, the science of our work. They usually use journalists or professors of communication. And the first time they did it, they didn't like my headline, so they're quibbling with the headline. Not one fact in my report that they disagree with. They just didn't like that the headline. They thought the headline might have given some people the wrong idea. And the headline was COVID surges in most vaccinated countries and counties. They didn't like that. That's a fact. That was a fact. It was the highest transmission. Some of the highest transmission countries and counties were the ones that had the highest vaccination rates. They didn't dispute that. They just didn't like the way I worded it in my headline, and they called that a fact check. That's not a fact check. That's you quibbling with a fucking headline. You're not quibbling with a fact. You're quibbling. That's not a fact check. And so they did that again. They did it. I just did another video, and they fact checked it again. And they're about aspiration when you give a vaccine, and they're 100% wrong on it. So I don't know what to tell you. The people checking that were not scientists. They weren't scientists. They weren't doctors. They were just journalists. No kidding. And like they had 5 people fact checking it. All of them were journalists. One was a professor, and one had a science degree in something else. But it's again and they're funded by Bill Gates. There you go.
I mean, they often cite, they always turn to some corporate captured regulatory agency like the CDC or FDA.
Yeah.
According to them, Jimmy Dore is wrong. Or according to the World Health Organization, number 2 funder is Bill Gates. But, you know, it's just this constant citation of
authoritative sources
sources that are discredited in the public eye.
Yeah, like Fauci. I caught him lying at 3 huge things over COVID. 3 huge things I caught Fauci lying about. So you can fact check me and say, oh, the government guy Fauci he says it's not true. So Jimmy's wrong. No, I'm debunking the government. The biggest purveyors of lies are the fucking government. The second biggest purveyors of lies and misinformation is the corporate funded establishment news outlets. That's why this show exists, not to repeat the government propaganda, but to debunk it. And that's why Google and YouTube and Bill Gates wants to shut places like us down, because they have a stranglehold on government and they have a stranglehold on establishment news. So they don't want any other point of view coming through. And that's exactly. And so they fund places like PolitiFact and they put fact in the name, even though they're the farthest thing from a fact checking organization. They're a propaganda organization. That's what PolitiFact is. They hire propagandists to write propaganda and they put fact on it, and people go, well, it's called PolitiFact. Go ahead. What do you want to say?
Well, I mean, back to what PolitiFact supposedly fact checked you for, that COVID is raging. Cases are spreading in highly vaccinated.
Oh, you froze.
The most vaccinated place on earth is canceling Christmas because COVID cases are spiking enormously.
Where's that?
Gibraltar is basically a gigantic pincushion.
You froze for a second. Can you go back? What's the most vaccinated place on earth that's canceling Christmas?
Gibraltar.
Okay.
It's basically a gigantic pincushion. And the 100% vaccination rate, and they're canceling Christmas.
What?
I mean, this proves everything you said in your segment that was fact checked by the Gates-funded PolitiFact.
100%. I've been 100% right on the COVID since we started covering COVID. And ever since we had Dr. Malone on our show, and he opened our eyes, the guy who invented the mRNA vaccine technology and is still currently working on vaccines. He's worked on vaccines and developed vaccines his entire life. People want to call that guy anti-vax. That's something like it. So if you disagree with the big pharma narrative, you're just immediately called anti-vax. And that's it. So I disagree with their narrative, and that's what's been happening to me. And we've been getting it from everybody. And it's all bad faith attacks. And, you know, the lefties in America are a bunch of nutless wonders. Look at YouTube. How many of them had the guts to fucking debunk Russiagate? Maybe 2 or 3 outlets. And now none of them has the balls to critique the establishment narrative on COVID or vaccines or even fucking Fauci. None of them. They're all nutless. All of them. And so that's why there's no left in America either. And then they shit on places like this and smear us when we actually do the work that lefties are supposed to be doing and standing up for workers and going against a mandate, which, by the way, is fucking unconstitutional, and the court's going to stop it. Already did. So this idea that we're in an emergency still, we're not in an emergency anymore. There's this idea you have to have emergency authorization for stuff to put it in kids. That's not real. We're not in an emergency. There's no emergency for kids in COVID. None. Kids have a bigger risk of dying from the flu than they do from COVID. That's a fact. And so this idea that we're in some kind of emergency is nuts. We're in an endemic. That's really what's happening, and we should learn how to live with a virus that only hospitalizes less than 1% of the people who contract the virus, and now they have new drugs that take that down 89%, according to them. So Merck has a drug and Pfizer has a drug, and they're supposed to reduce your hospitalization chances and serious illness by almost 90%. So,
well, yeah, and those drugs, we had to wait for the war on ivermectin to end until those drugs were produced.
Right.
Fauci was behind the war on ivermectin, the PR war on ivermectin. Fauci was heavily invested in the production of those therapeutics. They're saying 2022 will be the year of therapeutics. And Bill Gates has an enormous amount of shares in Merck, which has produced the Pfizer-mectin pill.
Why you never hear Dr. Fauci talking about that we could have saved 200,000 lives in the last year if we had Medicare for all? If he really cares about health and helping people get healthy and stay healthy and not dying, don't you think he would kind of mention the thing that would have saved 200,000 lives in 1 year? He never mentions it because Dr. Fauci is a fucking corrupt liar and he's not your friend. He's your enemy. But shit-libs and Democrats see him as an anti-Trump figure, so they lionize him when he doesn't deserve it. And now it's become some kind of culture war over Dr. Fauci. I'll tell you, Dr. Fauci's a fucking criminal and he should be in prison. And he lied to Congress and he did it several times. He should be in prison, but he's lying at the behest of the establishment, the big pharma-controlled government, and so there'll never be a price to pay for that. Just like there was never a price for people who did a torture campaign that was started by Dick Cheney and George Bush. There was never even a fucking hearing about it. So why? Because they were torturing people at the behest of the military-industrial complex. So there'll never be a price to pay. Just like there'll never be a price to pay for anything they do here. So anyway, I could talk about this all day. Max, thank you so much for coming on. Anything you want to add before we go?
I got a lot to add, but I think I should let you move on because I could talk about it all day too.
Yeah.
I guess I would just say that, since you mentioned the left's refusal to have a critique on the entire pandemic, except that, they're not going far enough in the restrictions, our governments. What's happening right now in Europe is a shocking human rights crime where people are being locked down, locked in their homes, and criminalized for simply not taking a leaky vaccine. And they're allowed to go to work, but they're being denied what the union movement, what the labor struggle has always fought for, which is 8 hours for what we will. They have to spend those 8 hours locked in their houses. In Austria, they've started locking down the unvaccinated. They're doing it in Netherlands now, leading to riots and massive protests, huge strikes of dock workers. In Rotterdam, the police shot dead, apparently, a protester last night. These protests are spreading into France because this is a human rights abuse with no scientific value whatsoever. And Austria, after the lockdown of the unvaccinated failed, is now locking down everyone. After massive protests, they will effectively ban all protests by locking everyone down. So where is the outrage about this? This is something that if I'd gone back in time 2 years and told everyone in the international left that this would have happened, they would have been shocked. But now, so many of them, not all, but so many, either quietly acquiesce or support it. And the human rights industrial complex, the Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, they're saying nothing about this.
Nothing.
No one's saying anything because it's all justified. This draconian regime of biomedical control is all justified in the name of public health, and no one's willing to question it.
So these lockdowns, all they do is transfer wealth upward. That's what happens during a lockdown. That's what happened to Bill Gates' fortune. That's what happened to Jeff Bezos' fortune. It exploded. So, and guess what happened? The workers got flattened. They said, we're only going to have to lock down for 2 weeks, and then we'll flatten the curve, and then we'll go back to our normal life. That never happened. And they keep moving the goalposts, and they keep saying, well, you get vaccinated, we'll get back to life. Oh, you get vaccinated, then you can go do whatever you want. Then it's like, oh, well, you still have to wear a mask even if you're vaccinated. Then it's like, oh, no, you can't. Now everybody's got to get vaccinated because vaccines don't stop you. But if vaccines don't stop you from getting the virus or transmitting it, what is the point of fucking mandating that other people get it? There is no point. There's no science behind any of this. And Google and YouTube try to suppress this kind of information. They'll probably demonetize this video. They demonetize a lot of shit when you tell the truth about it that goes against the Bill Gates funded narrative.
It was a controlled demolition of the economy that we witnessed from 2020 through today. That's what the lockdowns enabled. They didn't flatten the curve. They flattened the working class. 200,000 small businesses obliterated. Main Street demolished. Wall Street experienced this massive, rapid transfer of wealth. As I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, Bill Gates increased his fortune by $23 billion. And now they're doing it again across Europe. And we got to make sure it doesn't come here. And if it's not clear what the agenda is, Listen to what Boris Johnson has said. Look at what the NBA is doing to its players. Look at the agenda coming in with boosters. Everyone who got double vaccinated, and especially the young people who thought they were going out to do the right thing to protect themselves and others and their families, is going to be declared unvaccinated very soon, as they have been in Israel, as people over 65 have been in France, if they don't take a third shot. And Bloomberg recently published a piece citing various public health officials declaring that no one knows how many shots will be necessary. If vaccine passports are implemented, that means that you have to keep on that endless booster treadmill or maintaining your immunity by subscription to a big pharma product for the rest of your life in order to participate in society. That is dystopian.
I was watching The Hill the other day, and the D.C. bureau chief of The Intercept said that he got his booster shot. Ryan Graham said he got his booster shot because the holidays are coming up, and he didn't want to transmit the virus to other people in his family. And it's like, you fucking dummy. The vaccine doesn't stop you from transmitting the virus. It doesn't. You are not. He's virtue signaling. You're not protecting anyone else by getting vaccinated. You fucking propagandist at The Hill. That's the D.C. bureau chief, dumber than a fucking pothead comedian in his garage. That's the D.C. bureau chief of The Intercept, spreading medical misinformation, and they of course won't be flagged for it because they're on the corporate fucking algorithm, and they get pushed and they never get suppressed. But the actual accurate information on COVID will be suppressed, but their bullshit doesn't. It gets pushed. That was a complete medical misinformation. Ryan Graham from the D.C. bureau chief of The Intercept gave on The Hill on that show, saying that he got a booster shot so he didn't transmit the virus to all people in his family over the holidays. That's not how the vaccination works, you fucking moron. I know that, and I'm high. Okay, Max, thanks again. We gotta go. I gotta move on to another story. But everybody check out Max's work at The Gray Zone, and they have lots of great stuff published over there all the time. All right, thank you so much, Max.
Thanks a lot, Jimmy.